The Legendary Characters mod adds over 100 new lords and heroes to the game, spread across almost every single faction. There are fighters, casters, and everything in between, so let's take a look at every single one of them and go over how to best use them in your battles. Also, this video is of course sponsored by my besties at Instant Gaming, but more on that later. Right, just before we get into all these new characters, a few notes. Since there are over 100 of them, in the interest of time, both for you watching and me making the video, I'm not going to go into a crazy amount of detail on every single character. Unless they're incredibly unique with no point of comparison, I'll simply state what they're the most similar to and how they compare to that unit alongside any unique abilities. Alright, now let's begin with the Beastmen. Ragush of the Bloody Horn is pretty much a big ol' shielded Minotaur, and compared to a Doombull, he's about on par for damage with a lot more melee defense, but a lot less armor. His abilities enhance his damage alongside health and vigor. Ogre Four Horns is pretty much a berserker version of the Wargore heroes, much less armor but a little more defense alongside some poison damage, and he can increase his damage with an ability. From Bretonnia, the Hermit Knight of Malmont is a little more defense-focused paladin, dropping some attack to gain much more defense alongside armor-piercing damage. He has a lot of abilities to increase tankiness, especially whilst alone, and can heavily reduce the damage and defense of hostile large targets for a swift takedown. From the Chaos Dwarfs, we have Rykarth the Unbreakable. He's an armor-piercing Zatan with less attack but more defense and a bonus versus large. He has a number of abilities to increase damage and defense, as well as self-heal and deal area damage. For his mounts, he has a Great Taurus and a Lamassu. Baruk the Contemptuous is a larger bull centaur with access to the Lore of the Vampires and a number of powerful healing abilities. From the Demons of Chaos, we have Slavin Kurns. He's a weaker Chaos Lord with a bonus versus infantry and lack of shield. However, he also has a number of powerful ranged abilities to keep him strong. For his mounts, he has a demon-bred warhorse and a war mammoth. From the Dark Elves, we have Leithkir Fellheart. She drops a little attack compared to Lokir, but gains just as much defense alongside an armor-piercing bonus versus large. She can further increase her damage with abilities, as well as locking down retreating enemies. Shakara Riel is a much stronger sword and crossbow lord with a huge range damage at a shorter range alongside excellent melee power. They have a number of abilities to enhance all her forms of damage. For her mounts, she has a Dark Steed and a Dark Pegasus. The Hag Queen Melida drops defense and armor piercing from Crone Helbron to gain armor and the Madness of Cain imbued attacks. Just like Crone, she can increase her damage the more she fights. For her mounts, she has a Cauldron of Blood. Lilieth is slightly weaker than Morathi as far as actual fighting is concerned with the lore of dark magic. She also has a number of extra ability spells alongside powering up her magical power the longer the battle goes on. For her mounts, she has a Dark Steed, a Cold One, a Dark Pegasus, a Manticore, and a War Altar of Hecate. Coming to the heroes, we have Shadowblade. This is a much improved Khainite assassin with stat improvements across the board, including a huge boost to range damage. They also have a large number of active and passive abilities to do everything from increasing damage and defense to creating duplicate images to deceive enemies. The Furion of Clark Haronde is mainly a spellcaster, though a little stronger than a sorceress in melee, but should still be kept back in casting with this mix of the Lore of Dark and Fire. And for the mounts, we have a Dark Steed and a Cold One Chariot. Next up, the Dwarves, we have Helgar Longplates. She's a little weaker than a Dwarven Lord with a bonus versus infantry and more attack, but less armor and defense. She can also summon Bronn to aid her in combat, and Bronn is an ethereal buffed Thane with plenty of armor piercing damage. Brock Ironpick is not quite as strong as Grombrindle, but still a very powerful armor piercing melee fighter. Birnoth Grundadrak is a little less armor but more melee defense than Brock, but also loses armor piercing magical fire damage, so a large step down in damage output versus pretty much everything. Rorek Granithand has more defense than Brock, with a bonus versus infantry, but no armor piercing, so strong versus weaker chaff. Alric Ranulfsson has more attack and speed than Brock, but less defense and bonus versus large, making him better versus bigger targets. Sven Hasselfrazian in melee is much more defense focused than most, with high defense and no armor piercing damage. At range is much more deadly, with long range and high armor piercing, plus the ranged focus abilities you'd expect from an engineer. For the heroes, we have Hamne Ranulfsson, a little bit more armor and leadership than a Thane, but otherwise the same. Kazrik the Mad drops the shield to gain more leadership and armor piercing than Hamne. Grombrold Crudson is statistically identical to Kazrik with the potential to get damage abilities with an item. Torstun Treehacker is faster than Grombold and gains some low ammo, but very high ranged power. And lastly, Jugo Jurikson is a Slayer hero with less defense, but more attack and damage than the Dragon Slayer alongside a Berserk ability to massively increase damage for a short time. However, if you want to buff your ability to save on games permanently, you should check out Instant Gaming. Last year was a pretty great year for games, and 2025 is shaping up to be a banger in its own right. Over the next few weeks and months, there's a whole menagerie of games releasing, so why not save some money by picking them up with Instant Gaming? We got Final Fantasy VII Rebirth coming to PC in just under a week for 42% off. Then there's Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 in just over 2 weeks for 29% off. And then we've got Civilization 7 in just over 3 weeks for 27% off, and we're not even out of February yet. The point I'm getting at is if you buy and or play games, you should be using Instant Gaming to make sure you're getting the best deals possible. Whether you're playing on PC or any of the consoles, they have you covered with the best prices on just about anything you could ask for. And you can rest easy knowing they're backed up with 700,000 reviews on Trustpilot and 24/7 customer service, so you know you're in good hands. And of course, anyone who uses my link to buy some games is not only supporting the channel, you can also enter the monthly giveaways where you can claim anything you want for free store-wide. So one more time, check out Instant Gaming by clicking the link below, and thanks to you and Instant Gaming for sponsoring the channel. Coming to the Empire, we have Leetpold the Black. He's an unshielded but otherwise more powerful general of the Empire with more attack alongside armor-piercing magical damage. His abilities allow him to increase his own damage and flanking and make an escape whilst buffing his allies. For his mounts, he has a Painted Lark. Grand Marshal Erskine is much more similar to the generals, but with stat improvements across the board, a decrease in attack and some anti-infantry damage. Gunter Fredhoff has a little less health than Erskine, but otherwise identical stats, and has a number of abilities to keep him and allies in fighting form. He has a Salzenmund Noble Steed. Stefan von Kessel has better attack and armor piercing, but a slight decrease across the board from Gunter. He has abilities to enhance himself and allied units in melee. He has a Barded Warhorse and an Imperial Griffin. Thyrus Grumman has slight stat improvements over wizard heroes, but should still avoid melee as much as possible to focus on spells. Has a number of powerful spell-like abilities alongside the Law of Fire, and for his mounts he has Firemane. For the heroes, we have Aldred von Karaberg, pretty much a heavily improved Empire captain with no shield but a lot more armor-piercing anti-infantry damage. He has abilities to increase his own damage and allied leadership. For his mounts, he has a Barded Warhorse. Cronus Goodheart still has improvement over the captains, though not quite as drastic with only minor non-armor piercing damage bonuses alongside magical and fire. He has a number of powerful abilities to keep himself and allies alive and weaken enemies. And he has Warhorse. Halagrunzor the Horrible is a giant with reduced attack but much more defense, alongside defense sapping, slowing and fire vulnerability imbued attacks. He can increase his own speed of abilities alongside the leadership of allies and weaken groups of high damage enemies. Bassiano Dutra is a very buffed up witch hunter with no range damage but access to the Law of Death. He also has a bunch of abilities to enhance his and his armor's abilities to take on the undead. And lastly, Aurelion. This is a stronger mage from the High Elves who should stick to the back lines with that Law of High Magic, has more abilities to cause damage and chaos on the enemy lines, and keep his allies tough and tanky. He has a White Lion Chariot and a Griffin. From Grand Cathay we have a couple of heroes. Nanye Bunyo is most similar to Empire Engineers, but with stat decreases to everything but range, which is over double. Still do great range damage that slows and discourages targets, alongside abilities which increase damage the more kills it gets, boost damage output, and creates vulnerable targets out of enemies. Zhang Feng is statistically closest to these Celestial Generals, but with less armor and more damage with a bonus versus large. Can increase his own damage and reduce enemy defense with abilities for even more damage. He has a Red Mare and a Jade Longma. From the Greenskins we have Nobber Fangadoom. He's a stronger Goblin Great Shaman, but should still avoid combat versus most high tier units and focus on using the Law of the Little War. There's a bunch of abilities that do everything from execute nearby low HP units, to summon reinforcements, to massively boosting his stats at the cost of HP. And he can ride a Bad Moon Shrine Arachnarok Spider. For the High Elf Lords we have Eldyra. He's a stronger prince with more armor piercing damage but less defense and no shield. Abilities buff his own stats when he's confident and allow him to prevent entities from dying in an area for a short time. He has Maladros as his mount. Gallifreyus drops even more defense and armor to gain a bonus versus large, enhances charge speed and attack when confident, and grants all units increased charging power when she's in melee. She can ride a Great Eagle. For the heroes we have Aurelion, which is the same as the hero in the Empire, and Lawmaster Talarian, much more similar to a mage than a Lawmaster and should play just like one, so avoid melee and focus on spells with a mix of heavens and light. Abilities enhance his magical power and allow him to protect allied units. He can ride a Barded Steed or a Frostheart Phoenix. For the Khorne Lords we have Scar Bloodwrath, slower and less attack than a Bloodthirster, but a lot more armor and armor piercing damage. Abilities allow him to increase his charging powers and self-heal in combat. Abrax the Bloody, similar to the Chaos Lords of Khorne, with a lot more armor piercing, magical and burnt damage. Abilities increase his damage significantly, and he can ride a Thunderous Kruro. Khan the Vanquisher has better melee stats than Scar, but a little less damage. He increases that damage as time goes on, but reduces melee stats alongside increasing toughness, dealing bonus damage and self-healing with abilities. Haruma the Houndmaster is worse in most ways than the Exalted Heroes, but still a decent anti-infantry, non-armor piercing battler. His abilities allow him to buff nearby allies, and he can ride a Chaos Steed. Khorne the Baying drops a lot of stats from the Exalted Heroes, but gains a lot of speed and ranged power. Keep him at this range as much as possible for the most damage and safety, and feel free to keep him near charges, however, to get them moving faster. Gurney Iron Arm drops defense and armor from exalted heroes but gains more damage and anti-infantry to be a half decent chaff shredder. Can do great damage in melee and increase it with abilities alongside healing nearby allies and summoning the Crimson Death to aid him. This is a bizarre mix of Minotaurs, Bestigors, Black Arcs and humans. Still a strong melee infantry unit with a very high damage output and a lot of mass for a smaller unit. The Skull Taker hero is actually a lot stronger than the Lord Skull Taker but a little less defense and can increase damage even further with abilities. And of course can ride Cult to Run. The Mardag, compared to Gurney, is much faster and gains a nice chunk of defense alongside armor-piercing damage, can massively weaken nearby enemies with abilities. And lastly, Vaslo Krulled, much stronger exalted heroes with powerful charging and melee power and great armor-piercing damage. The more he charges, the better he gets, with several stacking abilities. For the Kislev Lords, we have Dmitry Saryov, a Boyar with 5 less defense and a shield, and can increase damage with an ability. For his mounts, he has a Warhorse and a Warbear. For the heroes, we have Grigory Medvedzy, slightly weaker Boyar with no anti-infantry, has a couple of abilities to more effectively take down enemies, and he can ride Fireheart. Vladimir Stormbringer is pretty much a male Frost Maiden with no spells, but a couple of damage-dealing ice abilities, keeping back and using those to get any value at all, and he can ride a Steppe Horse. Dennis Russ, the Werebear, is pretty much a single Warbear with a decent non-armor piercing anti-large damage. Use him just like a mounted Boyar against low armor. Ilya of Morova is most similar to Patriarchs, but swaps his support abilities for some armor-piercing range damage. Keep him at that range for the highest, safest damage. Abilities help him lock down enemies and deal increased damage. Nariaska Lacer, the Golden Knight, is slightly tougher than Boyars, but less damage. Abilities can increase that damage alongside plenty of toughness buffs for her and allies. She can ride a Warhorse and a Warbear. The Golden Knight, Nariska Lacer, not sure how that's different, gains some attack and damage over the previous form, but will perform mostly the same, will buff nearby lords and increase damage over time it's spent in combat. She can ride a Warhorse. For Lizardmen, we have the one Lord Slakgar. He's a less armoured, less damaging Saurus Oldblood, and can self-heal and increase toughness as well as lock down enemies with his abilities, and he can ride Croc Ilak. For Norsca, we have the one hero, Dazar Dumax, a slightly more damaging demon smith with no ranged but the full power of the Law of Hashut. Also brings along a magma cannon, which he summons at the start of every battle alongside buffing abilities for his lord. For the Nurgle Lords, we have Valnir the Reaper. He's an improved Chaos Lord of Nurgle with less melee stats but much higher armor piercing damage and can further increase damage with abilities as well as debuff enemies. And he can ride Bile Spew. For the heroes, we have Epidemius, more damage than Epidemius Lord, but less attack, deals constant damage around him and can buff the damage of nearby allied units. For the Ogre Lords, we have Tarog the Whalebearer, a little less armor piercing than an Overtyrant, but otherwise improvements across the board alongside the new ranged damage. Keep it at range for maximum damage and minimum risk. Place him with other ranged troops to target larger targets with his abilities. Vazgrat the Lucky gains more melee and ranged damage over Targog, but drops some range and attack. Still strong at both, but ranged is the way to go for safety. Abilities are much more focused on self-preservation, so don't be afraid to get into melee when you have to, and he can ride a Tyrant Killer. For the heroes, we have Brud the Blackened, more ranged than Vazgrat, but otherwise worse across the board, especially melee. Abilities are mainly focused on ranged, so keep him there as much as possible. Drulg Kineater has less armor and defense, but more attack and damage than a bruiser, so about the same in practice. Has a number of powerful abilities to self-heal, buff himself and debuff enemies. Katarina de Hanseborg is an ex-Bretonnian with very respectable anti-large damage and decent melee stats, strong versus low-armored large targets, and she can increase hers and allied damage with abilities alongside summoning various units to help her. Brow Slave Lord is slightly weaker than the Butcher, with no spells but a large number of spell-like abilities and an array of powerful effects. Hog Frostmaw is a very speedy hero with high armor piercing damage but low defense. He used Law of Ice from Kislev, so focus on that and finding favourable fights in melee. Has even more ice power and abilities, so really keep the cooldowns going. For the Skaven Lords, we have Cratch Doomclaw, a little less armor and attack than Queek, but much more armor piercing damage, so a very strong battler. Increases the defense of nearby allied units alongside buffing his own damage, and he can ride a Bone Breaker and a Brood Horror. Lord Nordwell is a slight stat improvement from Queek, but close enough to perform about the same job. Has a large number of buffing abilities for allied units. And he can ride a Bone Breaker, a Rat Ogre Chariot, and a Brood Horror. Night Lord Sneak is a massively buffed Master Assassin in both melee and from a range, powerful damage debuff and deception based abilities. Lord Morskatar, Emperor of Warlocks, is somehow a buffed version of Ikit Claw, at least in the ranged department. Melee is significantly worse, but the spells of Ruin are just as strong. Abilities buff his and nearby allied units' ranged power, so keep him back whenever possible. And he can ride Morskatar's Hellion. The Verminkin Packlord of Molders has buffs across the board coming from Throt the Unclean, making him very strong in melee. Abilities allow him to craft a Hell Pit Abomination on the battlefield and summon his Grand Experiment for aid, which is pretty much a buffed up mutant rat ogre with regeneration. For heroes, we have Ik Hackflay. He's a less armor piercing chieftain, but otherwise buffs across the board, so a strong non-armor piercing battler. He'll buff the toughness of allies and assume leadership should his lord tragically fall in battle. Filch Sharptail is an assassin with major buffs, including much more armor piercing damage. Abilities make him hard to pin down and allow him to take out footlords nearly instantly. Scar Blood Trail has buffs across the board from chieftains, including armor piercing damage, so a really strong frontlines battler. Abilities allow him to increase the power of allies over time, resulting in a highly destructive eventual rampage. Nate Bubo is like a Warpluck Giselle hero with exceptional range and very high single target damage. Keeping well back and firing on key targets at all times, his abilities allow him to increase his own damage output and weaken the defense of his targets. Veskit is a much shorter range than Nate, alongside having a massive buff to the melee side of things. Both melee and ranged deal a huge amount of damage, so getting close and do whichever is best at the time. He has all kinds of abilities to enhance his own stats in a number of ways. Luclox is pretty much a Skaven Necrofex with huge melee and ranged power. The ranged is high damage and has a huge range, so get that done first before moving into melee once you run out of ammo. He also has these Skaven spells of stealth, so go wild with anything you want with all the options. He's also immune to just about anything, is unspottable, executes units below 20% HP, and is just all around pretty cracked. For the Slaanesh Lords, we have Natasia Rolskolnikov, worse stats-wise than the Chaos Lord of Slaanesh, but has access to both the Lords of Slaanesh and Dark Magic, so has a lot of magical power, even if she is fairly useless in melee. Also has abilities to enhance her magical power and debuff enemies, and she can ride a Chaos Steed and a Chaos War Shrine. Solari, the Golden Lord of Pyromancy, has more defense than Exalted Keeper of Secrets, but less attack, damage, and charge, so a little bit less deadly. Still has the Lore of Slaanesh alongside abilities to deal more damage and enhance his defense. And for the Slaanesh heroes, we have the Mask. This is pretty much an improved Allurus, making her very powerful in melee, and comes with very powerful debuffing abilities. For the Tomb Kings, we have heroes. We have Nyloth the Charioteer, essentially a buff Tomb Prince with better melee stats and the same armor piercing anti-large damage. His abilities can send enemies into a rampage and improve his own damage, and he can ride a skeletal steed and a skeleton chariot. Serket is pretty much a heroic Tomb Scorpion, buffing most stats, but dropping some damage and poison to gain magic and damage over time. Abilities have pretty much the entire lore of Netikara bound and various magical buffs. For the Tzeentch Lords, we have Amon Shakai, a buffed Lord of Change that can silence and weaken his targets in melee, and has access to the laws of Tzeentch and Dark Magic, alongside abilities to cause further chaos and empower his magic. For the heroes, we have Zukuls, a buffed Iridescent Horror with much more ranged firepower, and has a number of powerful spell-like abilities alongside keeping himself stocked and shielded. The Changeling is a little scuffed, as you can see. It's pretty much a weaker version of the DLC Lord with the same lore of Tzeentch and ability to transform into a variety of Tzeentch units. The Blue Scribes change some stat rounds from the legit unit, but in general they're worse in melee with better ranged power and have a number of bound spells from all kinds of lores. For Vampire Coast, we have the One Lord, Infantra Leonora Nevere, a much more powerful Necrofex with access to a mix of laws of death and vampires, and has more damage and summons in her abilities. For Vampire Counts, we have a couple of lords. Mordecai Vretep is a weaker and more defensive vampire lord with the lore of the vampires, and has more classic vampire abilities for summons, healing, and magic. He can ride a Barded Nightmare and a Hellsteed. Vorag Bloodytooth is a buffed up Strigoi Ghoul King with a mix of the laws of death and vampires, and can improve his own damage and weaken enemies. For heroes, we have Gothar the Undying Knight, statistically identical to the White Knight, and can buff his own damage and defense. And he rides a Barded Skeletal Steed. Ulrika Magdova Strigov is weaker in melee but stronger from a range than the official hero, and has several abilities to buff most of her own stats. Obadiah Glothman is the exact same as a regular Necromancer hero, and can replenish your magic reserves and cause damage to enemies with abilities. He can ride a Nightmare, Corpse Cart, Unholy Lodestone Corpse Cart, and a Balefire Corpse Cart. For the Warriors of Chaos Lords, we have Strykar of the Sortinvinir. Worse melee stats but better damage than the regular Chaos Lord, only gets stronger the less health he has, and can plummet the stats of nearby enemies with abilities. He can ride a Serpent of Slaanesh. Vardek Krom the Conqueror is a less damaging but tougher Chaos Lord, and can buff his own stats and weaken enemies. He can ride a Demon-bred Warhorse and a War Mammoth. Vandred the Majestic is much more defensive but also more armor piercing than a regular Chaos Lord. He buffs his own stats and weakens enemies with abilities. Hargroth the Blooded, improvements across the board from the Chaos Lords, and can deal damage and buff his own damage. Phaetro the Tainted has less attack, but otherwise a major improvement over Chaos Lords, including a lot more armor piercing damage. He has a number of abilities to buff his own stats, weaken enemies, and deal plenty of damage. And lastly, Gutrot Spume, much more armor piercing damage alongside speed and armor than a regular Chaos Lord, plenty of damage abilities and defensive buffs. For the heroes, my favourite name of all of these, Slambo, has improvements over the regular Exalted heroes and some additional armor piercing range damage, lots of stat buffs, enemy debuffs, and some damage from his abilities. And lastly, Eorgric the Vile. Again, good buffs almost across the board from Exalted heroes, only get stronger the more he battles, even unlocking the Executioner passive to execute weak units. And lastly, we come to the Wood Elves. For the Lords, Queen Marisith, buffed up Glade Lord with a little better melee, but a lot stronger from a range with some great armor piercing. She can buff her own melee damage significantly with her abilities, and she can ride a Royal Chariot or a Luhathru. We have Prince Orion, not quite as buffed up as Marisith, but still an overall improvement from the Glade Lords. Works best with other ranged units to buff their stats and deal some strong ability damage of his own. And the final hero, Skor the Falconer, a buffed up Waste Stalker with much improved anti-infantry melee damage and huge range but reduced ranged damage. Buffs the defense of all nearby and can transform into an eagle to gain flight and melee power. So for a few closing thoughts and a review of this mod. Similar to the campaigns video, the main value this mod brings is sheer variety and quantity. There's over 100 new characters here, so you will find something for you no matter how specific your preferences. And similar to the campaign video, unfortunately the quality doesn't exactly equate to many unique options. As I said at the start, I compared most of these to something already in game, and for the most part, I didn't really have to go too much further since statistically they're similar to existing units, so won't add too much variety to your battle outside of their abilities. I feel harsh saying it because what exactly can they do outside of creating totally unique playstyles for each one, but it's a simple truth. This isn't a totally bad thing, however, as it means they're all very easy to get to grips with using, as you can just use them similar to their base units and enjoy any bonuses they have. Plus, the abilities really do go the extra mile in a lot of cases. Initially, I was going to show all the abilities on screen, however, most of these guys have over 4, and cutting out over 400 abilities for a single video would actually drive me insane, so I just stuck with talking about them. But my pain is your gain, as there really is so much power beyond the stats card for basically every single one of these guys. Of course, some factions come off better than others. Norsca get the shaft with one new character, and he's not even a Norscan, but that's just a lot accurate to Norsca at this point, so I'll allow it. All in all, combining the campaign and battle sides of this mod, I'd say it's a strong package to add some new faces to your campaigns with minimal downsides. As long as you're not expecting a bunch of complexity, and instead accept that you're just adding a bunch of names to people slightly stronger than existing generic lords and heroes, you'll have a great time. It may not be a total game change, but this is something you could leave on most of the time, and it'd only be a net improvement. Anyway, that's all I have on the battle side of things for the Legendary Characters mod. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Like, subscribe, check out Instant Gaming for some cheap games at the link below. And if you want more Warhammer 3 mod videos, then check out this one, all about the new campaigns this mod adds.